Welcome to today's 5-minute Bible study in the book of 2 Corinthians. We're still in chapter 12. The last few sessions we've been looking at the first 10 verses of chapter 12, in which Paul talks about this extraordinary visionary experience he had had. It had occurred about 14 years before he wrote the letter, and as we saw yesterday, he was caught up into the very presence of God. He describes it as the third heaven, or as paradise, in the very presence of God. Now he goes on to say, I am not able to tell about what happened to me there. Notice in verse 4, he says, I was caught up to paradise, and I heard inexpressible things, things that no one is permitted to tell. We don't know exactly what the experience was, but Paul says, I cannot express it. He calls it inexpressible. No one is permitted to tell. Now that can mean two things. It may mean that the vision was so extraordinary, there is no way to describe it adequately. When Paul says that it was inexpressible, he may mean that the vision itself was so beyond anything of this earth that I have no way to express to you what it was, or to adequately convey to you the meaning of it. So he may mean by inexpressible things, it is simply impossible to describe what I experienced in third heaven. Or he may mean that what I experienced is God does not allow me to tell. That God gave me this experience for my own spiritual benefit, but it was not something that I'm free to share with the world. It can mean either one. We just really don't know whether he meant it's inexpressible, you can't adequately convey what happened, or it's inexpressible. God said, this is not for the sharing, this is just a personal experience for you. But either way, Paul says this extraordinary experience I had, I am unable to convey to you. But remember, he's been kind of forced into boasting by these false apostles. And he has to give his credentials, and one of the credentials is this extraordinary visionary experience God had given to him. Now he goes on to say, there was a possibility that I might be tempted to pride by having such an experience. Notice he goes on to say, I will not boast about myself except about my weaknesses. For even if I should choose to boast, I would not be a fool because I'd be speaking the truth. But I refrain, that is, I refrain from boasting, so that no one will think more of me than is warranted by what I do or what I say, or because of these surpassingly great revelations. I don't want people to think more highly of me than they ought, or I don't want to think more highly of myself than they ought because God gave me these visionary experiences. They were all by grace. It has nothing to do with pride on my part. It was a matter of grace and grace alone. However, he says, there was a possibility I could become prideful about it. And so he says, therefore, in order to keep me from being conceited, I was given a thorn in my flesh, a messenger of Satan to torment me. Now, in tomorrow's session, we'll talk a little more about what this thorn in the flesh might have been. But Paul says that God gave me something or allowed something to happen in my life to keep me, prevent me, hinder me from becoming conceited about my visions. That is a thorn in the flesh. That is obviously a place of weakness. Where he goes on to say, listen, I'm going to boast about my weaknesses so that Christ's power may rest on me. So this thorn in the flesh had caused Paul to realize his own weaknesses. Even with those extraordinary visionary experiences he had, this thorn in the flesh caused him to focus on his weaknesses so that he would learn to depend on Christ. You see, he might have been tempted, well, look at the vision I've had. I could just rely on myself. But now he realizes this thorn in the flesh has taught him, I'm weak in myself. I must simply rely on Christ alone. He said, I asked God to take the thorn from me. But God said in verse 9, my grace is sufficient for you. My power is made perfect in weakness. So God did not remove the thorn, but allowed him to experience the wonder of God's power working through it. So even though Paul had a weakness, God's power was greater than the weakness, and God's power flowed through. He goes on to say, for when I'm weak, then I am strong, and God's power is made perfect in weakness. So out of this experience and this thorn in the flesh, Paul had learned to absolutely rely on God, not be proud in himself, but rely entirely on God and find the strength of God flowing even through places of weakness in his own body or his own flesh. What an extraordinary experience Paul had. First the vision, which was wonderful, and then to learn to rely entirely on God, even in places of my weakness. God's power is sufficient, and flows through. And tomorrow's session, we'll talk a little more about the thorn in the flesh, what it might have been. So we'll look at that in our next session together in our 5-minute Bible study in the book of 2 Corinthians.